In this lecture, you're going to learn about the Black is Beautiful movement, the Black Power movement, the Black Panthers, and Malcolm X. By the late 1960s, the movement begins to change, especially when it pertains to young people. The movement in the 1960s and 1970s emphasized Black racial pride and autonomy. Black is Beautiful became a slogan, and it will give birth to a cultural movement that showed pride in African ancestry and rejected white standards of beauty. For example, women began to wear their natural hair with pride, and the Afro hairstyle became popular among women and men. At the time, we began to see what we call the Black Power movement as well. Black Power advocates encourage African Americans to assert community control, and some within the movement also rejected the ethos of nonviolence. According to Black Power advocates, nonviolence only brought more beatings and killings. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the SNCC, who had been so active in the early 60s, will have a drastic change toward the end of the decade. The SNCC in the 1960s initially embraced civil disobedience and the nonviolence principles of Martin Luther King Jr. activists. However, as the commitment to nonviolence was tested by hostile whites who attacked demonstrators, and violence against them continued, Black churches were bombed, tenant farmers were thrown out of their homes, and more activists were beaten and jailed. The leaders of the SNCC began to wonder the effectiveness of nonviolence. Then SNCC leader Stokely Carmichael began to reject integration and assimilation. According to Carmichael, both implied white superiority. In 1966, the SNCC ousted its white members. The Student Nonviolent Coordinated Committee position paper explains. The myth that the Negro is somehow incapable of liberating himself, is lazy, etc., came out of the American experience. In the books that children read, whites are always good. Good symbols are white. Blacks are evil, or seen as savages in movies. Their language is referred to as a dialect, and Black people in this country are supposedly descended from savages. Any white person who comes into the movement has the concept in his mind about Black people, if only subconsciously. He cannot escape them because the whole society has geared his subconscious in that direction. The white people should go into white communities where the whites have created power for the express purpose of denying Blacks human dignity and self-determination. Whites who come into the black community with ideas of change seem to want to absolve the power structure of its responsibility for what it's doing, and saying that change can only come through black unity, which is the worst kind of paternalism. In an attempt to find a solution to our dilemma, we purpose that our organization, the SNCC, should be black staff, black controlled, and black financed. We do not want to fall into a similar dilemma that other civil rights organizations have fallen into. More and more, we see black people in this country being used as a tool of the white liberal establishment. Whites can only subvert our true surge and struggles for self-determination, self-identification, and liberation in this country. The political slogan of Black Power could encompass many meanings, but at its core, it stood for the self-determination of Black people in political, economic, and social organizations. The Black National Movement took many shapes in the form of pride and protest. One example was displayed during the 1968 Olympics. At the victory ceremony for the men's 200-meter run, Americans Tommy Smith and John Carlos, gold and bronze medalists respectively, received their medals shoeless, but wearing black socks that represented black poverty. Smith wore a black scarf around his neck to represent black pride. Carlos had his tracksuit top unzipped to show solidarity with all blue-collar workers in the U.S. and wore a necklace of beads, which he described were for those individuals that were lynched or killed and that no one said a prayer for, that were hung and tarred. It was for those thrown off the side of the boats in the Middle Passage. Once the national anthem began, they turned to face the U.S. flag, they raised one hand, and it remained raised until the anthem had finished. The Australian silver medalist Peter Norman wore a human rights badge on his jacket. The U.S. athletes described the gesture as a tribute to their African American heritage and a protest of the living conditions of minorities in the United States. Officials from the International Olympic Committee and the U.S. Olympic Committee judged the display to be counter to the ideals of the Games. Both American athletes were banned from the Olympic Village and sent home. The Australian Peter Norman was not disciplined. In his autobiography, Silent Gesture, Smith stated that the gesture was not a Black Power salute, but rather a human rights salute. The Black Power movement also led to a more radical form of political organization. In 1966, Huey Newton and Buddy Seel formed the Black Panther Party in Oakland, California. The Black Panthers became the standard bearers for direct action and self defense, using the concept of decolonization and their drive to liberate black communities from white power structures. The revolutionary organization also sought reparations and exemptions for black men from the military draft. Citing police brutality and racist governmental policies, the Black Panthers aligned themselves with the other people of color in the world against whom America was fighting abroad. Although it was perhaps most well known for its open display of weapons, military-style dress, and Black Power nationalist beliefs, the party's 10-point plan also included employment, housing, and education. The Black Panthers worked in local communities to run survival programs that provided food, clothing, medical treatment, and drug rehabilitation. They focus on modes of resistance that empower Black activists on their own terms. The graphic designer of this poster, Emory Douglas, was a member of the Black Panther Party. He served as art director for the Black Panthers newspaper and designed numerous political posters that depicted anger and defiant resistance. These emotional posters were in strong protest to the assassinations, war protesters, and race riots of the time. Malcolm X, a Nation of Islam NOI minister who had encouraged African Americans to pursue freedom, equality, and justice by any means necessary, also became a face of the Black Power movement. Prior to his assassination, Malcolm X and the NOI emerged as the radical alternative to the racially integrated, largely Protestant approach of Martin Luther King Jr. Malcolm advocated armed resistance in defense of the safety and well-being of Black Americans, stating, "I don't call it violence when it's self-defense. I call it intelligence." Like Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, before them, Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X represented different civil rights tragedies that both aim for racial justice. For his part, King and leaders from more mainstream organizations like the NAACP and the Urban League criticized both Malcolm X and NOI. King believed Malcolm X's speeches were a great disservice to Black Americans, claiming that they lamented the problems of African Americans without offering solutions. The differences between King and Malcolm X represented a core ideological tension that will inhabit Black political thought throughout the 1960s and 1970s. Towards the end of the decade, riots rocketed cities, protests hit campuses, and assassinations robbed the nation of many of its leaders. Urban riots, rather than anti-integration rhetoric, tainted many white Americans' perception of the civil rights movement and urban life in general. Civil unrest broke out across the country, but the riots in Watts, Newark, and Detroit were the most shocking. In each, a physical altercation between white police officers and African Americans spiraled into days of chaos and destruction. Tens of thousands participated in urban riots. Many looted and destroyed white-owned businesses. There were dozens of deaths, tens of millions of dollars in property damage, and an exodus of white capital that only further isolated urban poverty. The unrest of the late 60s did reflect a real and growing disillusionment among African Americans with the fate of the Civil Rights Crusade. In the still moldering ashes of Jim Crow, African Americans in Watts and other communities across the country bore the burdens of lifetimes of legally sanctioned discrimination in housing, employment, and credit. Segregation survived the legal dismantling of Jim Crow. The perseverance into the present day of stark racial and economic segregation in nearly all American cities destroyed any simple distinction between certain de jure segregation and non-certain de facto segregation. Some neighborhoods became traps that too few could escape. At the same time, we will see a series of assassinations that will rock the nation. On February 21st, 1965, 1 week after his home was firebombed, Malcolm X was shot to death by a Nation of Islam members while speaking at a rally of his organization in New York City. Then, in the spring of 1968, while preparing for a planned march to Washington to lobby Congress on behalf of the poor, King and other SCLC members were called to Memphis, Tennessee, to support a sanitation workers' strike. On the night of April 3rd, King gave a speech at the Mason Temple Church in Memphis. In his speech, King seemed to foreshadow his own untimely passing, or at least to strike a particularly reflective note, ending with his now historic words, "I've seen the promised land. I might not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as people will get the promised land. And I'm happy tonight. I am not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. Just after 6 p.m. the following day, King was standing on the second-floor balcony of the Lorraine Motel, where he and his associates were staying, when a sniper's bullet struck him in the neck. He was rushed to a hospital where he was pronounced dead about an hour later, at the age of 39. Shock of distress over the news of King's death sparked rioting in more than 100 cities around the country, including burning and looting. Amid a wave of national mourning, President Lyndon B. Johnson urged Americans to reject the blind violence that had killed King, whom he called the apostle of nonviolence. He also called on Congress to speedily pass the civil rights legislation then entering the House of Representatives for debate, calling it a fitting legacy to King and his life's work. On April 11, Johnson signed the Fair Housing Act, one of the last major pieces of civil rights legislation. 2 months later, after King's assassination, on June 6, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was killed campaigning in California. He had represented the last hope of liberal idealists. The rise of the Black Power movement challenged the integrationist dreams of many older activists, as the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X fueled disillusionment, and many alienated activists recoiled from liberal reformers. Political achievements such as the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act were indispensable legal preconditions of social and political equality. But for most, the movement's long and now often forgotten goal of economic justice proved as elusive as ever. I worked to get these people the right to eat cheeseburgers, Martin Luther King Jr. supposedly said to Bayard Rustin as they toured the devastation in Watts after the riots some years earlier. And now I've got to do something to help them get the money to buy it. What good was the right to enter a store without money for purchases? That is all for now. Please watch the next video lecture to learn more.